It was a case that gripped the city of Marietta, Georgia, not just for its violence, but for the betrayal at its core. In April of 2015, 16-year-old Jalen Martin was charged with the brutal murder of his best friend, 15-year-old Corey Miles, in what prosecutors would later describe as a premeditated act driven by jealousy and obsession. Two boys, inseparable since middle school, ended with one in a coffin and the other in chains. Jalen and Corey had grown up 2 streets apart. Their lives were woven together through neighborhood pickup basketball games, group chats, school projects, and the kind of inside jokes only teenage boys share. Corey was lively and funny, always surrounded by people. Jalen was more reserved but fiercely loyal. Teachers described them as always together, always laughing. On the surface, they were the kind of friendship that seemed like it would last decades. But behind that surface, something darker was building. Over time, Corey began to drift into new social circles, joining clubs, dating, gaining more popularity. Jalen, who had struggled with social anxiety, reportedly began to feel left behind. Classmates recalled subtle changes. Jalen started skipping lunch, opting to eat alone in the library. He stopped attending basketball practice despite being one of the better players. And when asked about Corey, he'd say less and less, sometimes offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. According to journal entries later entered as evidence, Jalen had been quietly unraveling. Pages filled with erratic thoughts, resentment, and cryptic notes about being forgotten and replaced. Some entries hinted at violence. What if I just erased everything? Would anyone even notice? But no one saw these pages until it was too late. On April 18th, Jalen and Corey agreed to meet at Walker Park around 5 p.m. It was a popular hangout, with walking trails and quiet creeks where teenagers often gathered to talk, smoke, or just escape their homes for a while. Surveillance from a nearby doorbell camera showed the boys walking together, talking casually. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But just under an hour later, a jogger discovered Corey's body near a wooded trail. Face down, blood pooling beneath him. He had been stabbed 9 times. His phone and backpack were gone. The community was stunned. A 15-year-old murdered in broad daylight in a public park? Panic spread quickly, and for a brief time it was believed a random attacker might be loose. But that theory dissolved within 24 hours. Investigators found Corey's phone discarded in a neighborhood trash bin 2 blocks from Jalen's house. Bloodstains matching Corey's DNA were found on a shirt buried beneath fresh soil in Jalen's backyard. When police arrived at Jalen's home, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply sat on the edge of his bed and asked, "Is he really dead?" During interrogation, Jalen initially denied involvement. But when presented with the evidence, he became silent. Not angry, not shocked, just still. Forensic analysis revealed that the wounds were delivered from behind, consistent with an ambush. The coroner's report indicated no signs of a struggle, which meant Corey likely trusted whoever was behind him in those final moments. In court, the prosecution didn't have to stretch far. They presented Jalen's journals, more than 50 pages of internal anguish, detailing his feelings of betrayal, abandonment, and finally, thoughts of revenge. They painted a picture of a boy consumed by resentment and quietly planning the destruction of the person who once meant the most to him. Jalen's defense argued diminished responsibility due to severe depression and mental illness. They called a psychiatrist who testified that Jalen suffered from dissociative episodes and may not have been fully aware of his actions. But under cross-examination, the expert admitted that premeditation was still possible, even within a disassociated mental state. Corey's mother sat through every day of the trial, clutching her son's favorite hoodie in her lap. When she finally spoke during sentencing, her voice cracked as she asked Jalen directly, "How could you take away the one person who would have forgiven you for anything?" The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Jalen Martin was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Today, he remains incarcerated at a state correctional facility. He has not spoken publicly. His family released a short statement expressing their heartbreak for Corey's family and their confusion over what their son had become. The case left a scar not just on two families, but on a community that had seen two boys grow up together and believed, like most of us do, that friendship has limits, but not fatal ones. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the cameras turned off, the question lingered. What does it take for love to turn into envy? For a friend to become a target, and for a quiet boy, once thought loyal and kind, to become a killer with a knife in his hand? It was the middle of June 2009 when Darren Cole's car was found at the bottom of a ravine off a remote back road in Farmington, Missouri. A passing trucker spotted the twisted metal nearly 40 feet down, lodged between trees, its front end completely crushed. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident. Another case of someone driving too fast, too late, on a road too poorly lit. But something wasn't right. Darren, a 41-year-old factory worker with a reputation for quiet reliability, had no history of reckless driving. The weather that night had been clear, dry. No skid marks lined the road, and when investigators pried open the driver's side door, they found Darren slumped in the seat, but the seatbelt had been sliced clean through. There was no blood spatter, no airbag deployment, and most notably, no sign of a struggle. What at first looked like bad luck soon began to look like something else, especially once they talked to Samantha Bryce. Samantha, 38, had been Darren's fiancée for nearly 5 years. She worked part-time at a salon and was well-liked around the neighborhood. Warm, chatty, often seen walking her dog or tending to the flowers outside their modest home. But her reaction to Darren's death caught detectives off guard. Not cold exactly, but oddly rehearsed. She described Darren as distant lately, mentioned that he'd been having trouble sleeping, seemed down. She floated the idea, without being prompted, that maybe it was suicide. Then came the insurance policy. 3 months before his death, Darren had increased his life insurance coverage to $250,000. The beneficiary? Samantha. His family didn't even know the policy existed. When asked, Samantha claimed Darren had wanted to make sure she and her daughter would be cared for. But it wasn't just the money. Investigators pulled Samantha's internet search history. The entries were chilling. How to sedate someone without them noticing. Best places to crash a car that looked like accident. How long after Ambien does it work? They also found an Amazon order receipt for a high-dose over-the-counter sleep aid, purchased 2 weeks before Darren died. A toxicology report was ordered. Though Darren's body had been badly bruised from the impact, his blood showed elevated levels of diphenhydramine, a sedative. Not enough to kill, just enough to make someone drowsy, enough to make someone unable to react. Then came the phone data. On the night of the crash, Samantha's cell phone pinged a tower near the ravine, twice. She claimed she'd taken a drive after an argument. The prosecution saw it differently. They pieced together a theory. Samantha had drugged Darren, loaded him into his car while he was barely conscious, drove to the edge of the ravine, put the car in neutral, and rolled it off the incline, hoping gravity would do the rest. She then walked back to her own vehicle, drove home, and waited for someone else to discover the wreckage. Her trial began in late 2010, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched in the state. The prosecution argued that Samantha was calculating, manipulative, and entirely motivated by money. The defense painted her as a woman pushed to the edge, living with a man prone to anger and emotional withdrawal, and claimed Darren had taken the pills himself. One of the most haunting moments came when Darren's sister took the stand. She recounted how, after the funeral, Samantha had smiled gently and said, "At least he's at peace now." She said it like someone reading a line. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Samantha Bryce was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, she reportedly showed no emotion, just stared forward, as if waiting for it all to be over. In a post-sentencing interview, one juror said, "I think she planned it for months, and I think if we hadn't caught the search history, she would have gotten away with it." The home Samantha once lived in has since been sold. Darren's family still holds memorials on the anniversary of his death. And though the courtroom doors have long since closed, the case remains one of the most chilling examples of premeditated manipulation masked behind a soft voice and steady smile. A reminder that murder isn't always loud or frenzied. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and planned with care. The residents of Eugene, Oregon, thought of Erin McCaskill as the kind of nurse you'd want caring for your aging parents. For nearly 2 decades, she worked at Brookwood Assisted Living, a private care home tucked into a leafy suburb. Erin, now 42, was praised for her calm demeanor, her long shifts, her way of comforting families with a soft tone and patient explanations. But behind that carefully constructed persona was something else, something lethal. Between March and May of 2020, 3 elderly residents at Brookwood died under sudden and similar circumstances. All 3, Mildred Lanning, age 89, Harold Denton, age 93, and Ethel Kramer, age 87, had varying stages of dementia. They were frail but stable. Each of their deaths was labeled natural causes. No autopsies were ordered. And with the country deep in COVID lockdowns, families couldn't visit or say goodbye in person. But the 4th didn't die. Walter Green, 91, suddenly became violently ill after a late-night tea offered by Erin herself. His daughter, visiting the next morning through a window, noticed his disorientation, slurred speech, and tremors. She insisted on transferring him to the hospital. That decision likely saved his life. Toxicology revealed the presence of scopolamine, a powerful anticholinergic used in motion sickness patches, but dangerous in high doses. It's been referred to in true crime circles as the devil's breath, for its use in robberies, assaults, and even covert killings. Hospital staff alerted police. A search warrant was issued for Erin's apartment. What they found turned the case from a nursing error into a suspected serial poisoning. Tucked into a locked drawer were multiple transdermal scopolamine patches, though she'd never been prescribed them. More damning, a handwritten list of medications and dosages, cross-referenced with names of the deceased patients, underlined and dated. Her browser history was worse. How to administer lethal dose without trace, slow death in elderly, ways to euthanize quietly, and will COVID mask sedative overdose. The last search was dated just 1 week before Harold Denton died. When Erin was brought in for questioning, she didn't deny the tea. She said she gave Walter a little something extra to help him sleep, and described the act as compassionate. Her demeanor during questioning never cracked. She spoke calmly, clinically, as if giving a medical report. "I didn't hurt them," she told detectives. "They were already gone. I just helped them get there faster." Authorities began the process of exhuming Mildred, Harold, and Ethel. Though decomposition had set in, tissue samples revealed similar traces of scopolamine, far beyond any therapeutic dose. Prosecutors now had a pattern, a method, and a motive that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Erin believed she was doing the right thing. Her trial began in 2022 and drew national attention. Prosecutors called her the angel of death in scrubs, pointing to her notes, her unprescribed medication, and her own words. The defense argued Erin had been overworked, undersupported, and had experienced a psychological break during the isolation of the pandemic. They cited years of caring for dying patients as emotionally corrosive, but the jury wasn't convinced. The most haunting moment of the trial came when Walter Green's daughter testified. She recounted Erin smiling at her through the glass as her father faded, reassuring her that everything's under control. Her voice shook as she said she was killing him, and thanking me for trusting her while she did it. After 6 hours of deliberation, Erin McCaskill was found guilty on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She never apologized. In her final statement to the court, she simply said, "They were suffering. I just didn't want them to be alone." The case still divides the town of Eugene. Some former co-workers insist Erin was compassionate to a fault. while others now say they always felt something was off but couldn't put their finger on it. But for the families of the victims, the truth is colder. Their loved ones weren't eased into death. They were stolen. And a nurse, a woman trained to heal, had turned her knowledge into something quietly monstrous. The town of Waukegan, Illinois, had never seen a case like it. In the fall of 2017, the trial of Marcus Holloway, a 22-year-old college dropout, drew crowds that wrapped around the courthouse steps. Cameras rolled. Reporters whispered comparisons to Bundy. The reason? The charges against Marcus weren't for a single murder, but for orchestrating the deaths of 3 women, all of whom believed they were in a relationship with him. Marcus didn't look the part of a manipulative killer. He was clean-cut, soft-spoken, and intelligent, once a straight-A student who had planned to study psychology. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. He dropped out of college, moved back in with his mother, and began a quiet but elaborate double, or rather triple, life online. Using dating apps under different aliases, Marcus simultaneously courted multiple women, often pretending to be someone new, an entrepreneur, a fitness trainer, a medic. His charm was consistent, gentle, attentive, romantic. But as each relationship deepened, so did his control. The first victim, 24-year-old Denise Calderon, died of an overdose in August 2016. She had a history of anxiety, and her death was originally ruled accidental. But her autopsy showed she had high levels of alprazolam, a drug not prescribed to her. 6 months later, a second woman, Kelly Monroe, was found dead in her apartment. She had also overdosed. The similarities between the cases were dismissed at first. There was no clear connection between the women until the third. Jessica Loomis, just 21, had called 911 from her own apartment in March of 2017, gasping and panicking, saying she'd been poisoned. Dispatch lost the call before she could explain. By the time paramedics arrived, she was unconscious. She never woke up. That was when detectives began connecting dots. A single number appeared in all 3 of their phone records, Marcus's. Digging deeper, they uncovered a tangled web of messages, love letters, and evidence of psychological manipulation. Marcus had convinced each woman she was the only one. In some texts, he wrote that he worried they were suicidal. In others, he offered to help them through it if it ever came to that. In Denise's case, he allegedly left pills on her nightstand. For Kelly, he told her, the world didn't deserve someone like her. And with Jessica, the evidence was clearest. She had been texting a friend days earlier, saying she felt scared of Marcus, and that he had joked about how peaceful dying in sleep must be. At trial, the prosecution presented Marcus as a textbook predator, someone who used emotional manipulation as a weapon. They argued he didn't kill out of rage or impulse, but out of control and obsession. He wanted these women to belong to him entirely, and when they started to drift away or question his lies, he made sure they'd never leave. The defense tried to argue the deaths were coincidental, that Marcus suffered from untreated personality disorders, that he never physically forced anyone to do anything. But jurors weren't swayed. The texts, the matching overdose methods, and a chilling audio diary recovered from Marcus's laptop told a different story. In one entry, he said, "I think I'm just helping them find peace. If I can't make them happy, at least I can make them quiet." The courtroom fell silent when that was played aloud. After a 3-week trial, Marcus Holloway was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His mother wept. He didn't. To this day, the case is studied in criminal psychology courses for its complexity. Marcus never physically harmed his victims in the traditional sense. There were no beatings, no blood. But the damage was just as fatal. He weaponized trust, love, vulnerability. He built each of them up, then took everything away. And in the eyes of the court, that made him every bit the killer. It started with a phone call, a panicked, breathless voice screaming for help. On a cold February night in 2013, emergency services were dispatched to a quiet cul-de-sac in Boise, Idaho, where a 14-year-old girl had just discovered her mother's body in the garage. The woman, Andrea Sullivan, a 42-year-old local librarian, had been bludgeoned and strangled. Her hands were bound with an extension cord. There were no signs of forced entry. When police arrived, Andrea's husband, Greg Sullivan, stood outside in slippers and a t-shirt, visibly shaking. He claimed he had been asleep, said he had no idea what had happened. But something about his affect struck the officers. More confused than grieving, more flat than fearful. The investigation began immediately. Andrea had no known enemies. No affair, no money troubles. Everyone described her as kind, quiet, almost invisible in her daily routine. But the crime scene told a different story. This was no random act. Security footage from a neighbor's home showed no unfamiliar cars or people near the Sullivan residence that night. No break-in, no noise. And then, two critical discoveries shifted everything. The first was inside Greg's workshop. A claw hammer wiped clean, but with traces of blood under the handle. The second was on Andrea's own phone. She had been recording. Just over 5 minutes of audio captured her final moments. Muffled arguing. A man's voice low and furious. Then screams. Then silence. When analyzed by forensic experts, the voice was unmistakably Greg's. He was arrested 2 days later and charged with first-degree murder. But it was the trial that would make national headlines. Greg Sullivan wasn't a career criminal. He was a church deacon, a former high school baseball coach, and the father of 2. His defense claimed the marriage was quietly falling apart, that Andrea had become emotionally abusive, and that Greg snapped after years of bottled resentment. The prosecution painted a different picture, one of premeditation and control. Text messages revealed that Greg had been searching for divorce lawyers weeks before the murder, but changed course abruptly after learning Andrea had opened a separate bank account. They argued that he couldn't bear the thought of her leaving first, that it wasn't rage, it was ego. Their daughter, the same one who found the body, testified against her father. Tearfully, she recalled hearing arguments late at night, her mother's growing fear, and one moment weeks before the murder where Andrea had said, "If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." The most chilling moment came when the prosecution played the audio file in court. Not the whole thing, just enough to capture the tone, the escalation, the fear in Andrea's voice. Jurors turned away. One woman reportedly left the room in tears. Greg sat stone-faced. He didn't cry, didn't flinch. After 8 days of testimony and less than 5 hours of deliberation, Greg Sullivan was found guilty. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. In his final statement, Greg said only, "I lost my way. I lost everything." Andrea's name is now engraved on a bench outside the city library where she once worked, a quiet memorial for a quiet woman. Her story, however, continues to echo through the legal system, a reminder that the most violent crimes don't always come from strangers. Sometimes they come from across the dinner table, sometimes from the person lying next to you, and sometimes the person you trust the most is the one you should have feared all along. In the summer of 2011, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, was sweltering, days stretching into 90-degree heat, tempers short, windows open. On one such afternoon, neighbors along the 800 block of Cypress Street heard a strange rhythmic banging coming from inside a tan duplex. It went on for nearly 30 minutes. Then it stopped. 2 days later, the smell started. What police found inside the home was so disturbing, officers had to be rotated out of the scene. In the bathtub lay the body of 68-year-old Leonard Chase, a retired postal worker. He had been beaten with a metal pipe, then submerged in scalding water. The killer had attempted to bleach the crime scene, but only partially. Blood soaked the base of the tub, and drag marks led from the kitchen to the bathroom. Arrested just hours after the discovery was Leonard's own granddaughter, 21-year-old Naomi Chase, a former nursing student with no prior record, no signs of prior violence, and no discernible motive that anyone could understand. What made the case so chilling and so legally complicated was what Naomi claimed in her confession. She said her grandfather had been abusing her since she was a child, that no one believed her, that the final fight began over something small, a grocery receipt. But when he raised his hand, she saw red and didn't stop. In her words, it was the only time he looked afraid of me. The prosecution didn't deny that Leonard had a past. There were whispers of family tension, even a closed case from 1997 involving accusations that were later dropped. But there had never been proof. No witnesses, no formal charges. To the court, Leonard was a respected veteran and family man. Naomi, in contrast, was now a confessed killer who had tried to clean up the scene before fleeing. Her trial was a minefield of emotion. Advocates for abuse victims filled one side of the gallery. Leonard's former co-workers and church friends sat on the other. The defense argued that Naomi had lived in fear for most of her life, and when the threat returned, however minor, it triggered years of trauma. They brought in psychologists who testified to complex PTSD, dissociation, and the possibility of temporary depersonalization. But the prosecution hit back hard. They said Naomi had stayed in her grandfather's home by choice, that she was an adult, that instead of leaving she chose violence. The bleach, the cleanup, the delay in calling 911, these weren't signs of trauma, they argued. They were signs of calculation. Jurors watched the interrogation tape closely. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't break down. Her voice was flat, almost detached, as she recounted what happened. At one point, she even asked the detective if he looked surprised when it happened. When the detective asked why that mattered, she replied, "Because he always thought I was weak." That one sentence split public opinion. To some, she was a victim who snapped. To others, she was a murderer rewriting history. The jury deliberated for nearly 17 hours. Ultimately, they returned a verdict of guilty, manslaughter, not murder. The judge sentenced Naomi to 22 years, citing mitigating trauma, but also condemning the brutality of the act. She is currently serving her sentence at the Gloria MacDonald Women's Facility. In a 2018 interview, she said only this: "It wasn't justice, but it was an ending. And sometimes that's enough." The case still lingers in Rhode Island's legal circles as one of the most morally complex to ever enter a courtroom. No one walked away clean. A man is dead. A woman is behind bars. And the truth, whatever it really was, remains tangled in silence, trauma, and the kind of fear that doesn't leave bruises. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. In January 2018, the small town of Casper, Wyoming, was blanketed in snow when a strange fire broke out at a suburban home on the outskirts of town. Firefighters were dispatched after a neighbor reported thick black smoke rising from a second-story window. By the time crews arrived, flames had engulfed the upper level. What they found inside was horrifying. On the second floor, in what remained of the master bedroom, they discovered the charred body of 39-year-old Trina Weber, mother of two, elementary school teacher, and by all accounts, a beloved member of the community. Her body was curled beside the bed, partially wrapped in a burnt bedsheet. The fire hadn't killed her. That was clear from the start. The autopsy revealed multiple blunt force injuries to the back of her skull, consistent with repeated strikes from a hammer. She had been dead before the fire started. The blaze had been set intentionally, with accelerants poured along the hallway carpet and doused on the mattress. Investigators immediately turned to Trina's husband, Brent Weber. He was nowhere to be found. The couple had been married for 11 years. To the outside world, they seemed stable, church-going, social. But when police began to dig, they found cracks. Financial stress, tension at home, and a hidden second mortgage Brent had taken out without Trina's knowledge. He had also recently taken out a life insurance policy on her for $500,000. Brent was arrested 3 days later, found sleeping in his car near a rest stop just across the state border in Montana. In the back seat were 2 suitcases, a duffel bag full of cash, and Trina's wedding ring. What unraveled in the courtroom would be one of the most methodical, cold-blooded cases the state had ever tried. Prosecutors argued that Brent had planned Trina's murder for weeks. The motive was simple: money. With mounting debt and the fear of losing their home, Brent saw an opportunity. The life insurance policy was his solution. Investigators found internet searches on his laptop dating back months, undetectable poisons, how to stage a break-in, and arson evidence removal. But he didn't use poison. He used a hammer from his own toolbox. According to the forensic timeline, Brent waited until his children were asleep, then attacked Trina as she folded laundry in the bedroom. He struck her 3 times in the back of the head. The coroner believed she died instantly. Brent then attempted to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, staging drawers, pulling jewelry, setting the fire to cover it all. But he made one mistake. Trina's smartwatch, a newer model she had just started using, continued to track her heart rate and steps right up until the moment she died. It also showed a sudden spike in heart rate, then a flatline. That data, prosecutors said, was the silent witness to her final moments. Brent's defense claimed emotional breakdown. They said he had snapped under the pressure of financial collapse, that he didn't plan the murder, that the fire was panic, a mistake, a moment of fear. But the jury didn't believe it, especially not after hearing Brent's 911 call, placed hours after the fire, not to report the crime, but to ask if anyone else had been found. His voice was calm, casual, almost curious. The trial lasted just under 2 weeks. Brent Weber was found guilty of first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Trina's children were placed in the custody of her sister. The house, now demolished, is an empty lot, snow-covered most of the year, eerily quiet. Those who knew Trina still gather at her old school every January, lighting candles in her memory. They remember her laughter, her generosity, her way of bringing warmth into even the coldest classrooms. And in the end, the court delivered a message that cut through the silence. Murder for money is as old as time. But no amount of debt justifies killing the person who trusted you with their life. The call came just after midnight on August 9, 2014 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A quiet neighborhood was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. Several residents dialed 911, reporting that a woman had been running barefoot through the street, her face bloodied, banging on doors, shouting that her boyfriend was trying to kill her. By the time officers arrived, 26-year-old Nicole Hartley had collapsed on a neighbor's lawn, her arms bruised, her shirt torn. In a breathless, panicked voice, she repeated the name over and over. Justin! Justin did it. Police entered the home she had fled from, a modest rental near the outskirts of the city. Inside, they found 30-year-old Justin Koenig standing in the kitchen, calm, shirtless, smoking a cigarette. In the living room was a scene that would later be described in court as deliberate, ritualistic, and unfathomably cruel. On the floor lay the body of 19-year-old Adriana Cruz. Her hands were bound with speaker wire. Her mouth was gagged. She had been stabbed 42 times. The room was lit only by a single lamp. A camcorder sat on a tripod, pointed at her body. At first, Justin said he had no idea how she got there. Claimed he'd been asleep. Said maybe Nicole brought her, but he couldn't explain the footage. Police reviewed the tape. What they saw was both horrifying and damning. Justin had recorded the last 2 hours of Adriana's life, taunting her, accusing her of trying to steal Nicole from him. The video captured the moment he struck her the first time. Then again, and again, all while Nicole, tied to a chair just off camera, screamed for him to stop. The horror of what had happened didn't fully register with the public until the trial began months later. Prosecutors described Justin as a textbook manipulator, a man who had exerted control over both women for years, psychologically abusive, jealous, and increasingly violent. Nicole and Adriana had become friends through a community college class. What started as a casual friendship grew into something more intimate, something Justin viewed as betrayal. Text messages revealed Justin had installed tracking apps on both of their phones. He monitored conversations, searched browser histories, and frequently accused Nicole of cheating. As her relationship with Adriana deepened, he became unhinged. Nicole later testified that he made threats constantly. That he told her, "If I can't have you, no one will." She said the night of the attack, he locked all the doors, smashed her phone, and waited for Adriana to arrive. He lured her over by using Nicole's account, sending a message saying she needed help. The jury listened to the 911 calls. They watched clips from the footage, heavily redacted but enough to convey the brutality. Nicole, who had managed to escape after breaking free from the chair, was the prosecution's star witness. She sobbed on the stand but never broke down. "I should have left him years ago," she said. "But I was scared. And now someone else is dead because I didn't." The defense tried to argue insanity. That Justin had suffered a psychotic break, that he had lost touch with reality, that the video showed a man not in control of his mind. But psychologists testified that he had full awareness of his actions, before, during, and after the crime. He had wiped down surfaces, deleted files, and even tried to create a fake alibi by texting a friend hours after the murder pretending everything was normal. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Justin Koenig guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 60 years, no chance of parole. Adriana's mother, who sat through every moment of the trial, held up her daughter's graduation photo as the sentence was read. "She wanted to be a teacher," she said. "Now all I have left is this." Nicole entered a protection program and moved out of state. In a later interview, she said, "Some monsters don't hide in the dark. They sit beside you, sleep in your bed, smile at your parents." The court didn't just convict a killer. It exposed how manipulation, jealousy, and control, when ignored too long, can escalate into unspeakable violence. And how sometimes love doesn't just blind, it kills. In April 2015, in the quiet farming town of Grandview, Washington, a frantic 911 call came from the parking lot of the local elementary school. A teacher had just discovered the body of Principal Daniel Reiner, slumped behind the wheel of his car. At first it looked like a suicide. His service pistol was in his lap, a single gunshot wound to the chest. But within minutes, responding officers knew something was off. There was no gunshot residue on Daniel's hands. No blood spatter on the pistol grip. The windows were rolled up, yet the entry wound was unusually angled. Most damning of all, the school's security cameras had mysteriously gone offline at 2:13 a.m., exactly 4 hours before his body was found. Principal Reiner had been both respected and controversial. He was known for strict discipline, zero-tolerance policies, and an abrasive management style that had led to the resignations of multiple staff members over the years. Still, no one expected murder, not in a town of barely 10,000 people. The investigation led police down an unexpected path, one that pointed not to an angry parent or stranger, but to someone within the school's own staff. That person was Olivia Reyes, a 28-year-old third-grade teacher. Young, energetic, and widely adored by her students, Olivia had clashed repeatedly with Principal Reiner. Complaints of favoritism, bullying, and harassment had been swept under the rug for months. Then came the letter. 1 week before his death, Reiner had submitted a formal request to the school board recommending Olivia's suspension, citing insubordination and inappropriate emotional boundaries with students. Olivia, in turn, had written a 7-page response accusing him of retaliation, manipulation, and inappropriate conduct of his own. But what sealed her fate wasn't the paperwork. It was the footage Reiner had backed up to a private flash drive, one police found locked in the glove compartment of his car. On it was a screen recording taken from his office computer. It showed Olivia entering his office late one night, using a copied keycard. She rifled through his drawers, opened his email, and printed out a document labeled Termination Draft, Reyes. She hadn't known the computer was set to record all activity. When confronted with the footage, Olivia confessed, but not to murder. She admitted she'd been angry, paranoid, afraid of losing her job. But she claimed she only wanted to confront him, to make him stop. What happened next, she said, was an accident. According to her statement, they met in the parking lot around midnight. She brought the gun, not to kill him, but to scare him. She told him to resign to stop the rumors. He laughed, called her bluff. They struggled. The gun went off. She panicked, cleaned his hands, wiped the car down, left the scene. But the forensic evidence told a different story. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. The trigger pull was clean. The entry wound was precise, center mass, not consistent with a chaotic fight. The prosecution argued that Olivia had planned it all. The copied keycard, the timed security blackout, the surveillance camera tampering. Even the angle of the shot, they said, pointed to someone who had watched and waited for him to fall asleep in his car before pulling the trigger. The most disturbing piece of evidence came from Olivia's personal journal. One entry, dated 3 days before the murder, read, "He took everything from me. Now I'll take what he thinks is safest. His reputation. His life." During the trial, Olivia wept openly, said the journal entry was a fantasy, nothing more. Her attorney pushed for voluntary manslaughter, but the jury didn't buy it. After 9 hours of deliberation, Olivia Reyes was found guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 32 years in prison. In the aftermath, the school board was rocked by scandal. Allegations surfaced from multiple teachers who claimed Daniel Reiner had used fear and favoritism as tools of control, but none had ever considered it could end in bloodshed. A bronze plaque honoring Reiner was quietly removed 2 years later. The school remains open under new leadership. Olivia's classroom, once filled with drawings and science posters, is now used as storage. The case left the town with no heroes, only unanswered questions. Was Olivia a victim who finally snapped, or a manipulator who believed she could outsmart the system? Either way, the courtroom reached its conclusion. Sometimes justice isn't about who's right. It's about who's left and what they're willing to admit. In the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina, a historic church known for its community outreach and late-night youth programs became the center of a case that would grip the entire state. The church's beloved youth pastor, 34-year-old Elijah Maris, was found dead on a Monday morning in March 2019. His body sprawled at the bottom of the sanctuary steps. At first, parishioners thought it was a tragic accident, but the blood trail told a different story. Elijah had been stabbed 17 times. His wallet and phone were untouched. Nothing was stolen. It was not a robbery. It was personal. The city mourned. Candlelight vigils were held. Hundreds attended the funeral. Elijah had been a mentor to dozens of kids from broken homes, a leader in addiction recovery programs, and an outspoken advocate for at-risk youth. But within a week, police had a suspect in custody. His name was Troy Banks, 18 years old. He had been one of Elijah's mentees for over 2 years. A high school dropout with a history of minor offenses, Troy was frequently seen around the church. Elijah had taken him under his wing, offering him odd jobs, a place to sleep, even driving him to court dates. So why had he killed him? The answer came from a single email, an unsent draft on Elijah's church-issued laptop. In it, Elijah had detailed an upcoming meeting with church leadership to discuss Troy's behavior. He wrote about missing petty cash, vandalism, and growing concern that Troy was using again. More importantly, he wrote about an incident he hadn't yet reported to police, a threat Troy had made when confronted about stolen sound equipment. Elijah had written, "I'm afraid of what he'll do if I press this, but I can't let it slide. The other kids need to know we stand for something." That email never made it out of the drafts folder. Security camera footage sealed the case. Though the system at the church's front entrance had been disabled, a camera across the street captured Troy arriving at the church just after 2 a.m., wearing a hood and carrying a backpack. He left 3 hours later, empty-handed, his sweatshirt stained. When arrested, Troy denied everything. Said Elijah had let him stay the night, claimed he'd woken up and found him already dead. But blood on Troy's shoes matched Elijah's. And inside his backpack was the murder weapon, a hunting knife from Elijah's own office, with Troy's prints on the handle. The trial was swift. Prosecutors laid out the timeline in meticulous detail. The thefts, the confrontation, the email, the final act of violence. They argued that Troy had feared being cut off, losing access to the only stable place he had left. Rather than risk exposure, he lashed out. The defense tried to invoke Troy's trauma. Abused as a child, homeless by 16, he had lived in survival mode for years. They claimed Elijah's mentorship had become controlling, too intense, that Troy felt suffocated, that maybe he snapped. But Elijah's history said otherwise. Dozens of young people testified in court, sharing how Elijah helped them through addiction, poverty, depression. He never asked for payment, never sought praise. He just showed up. The courtroom fell silent when Elijah's mother took the stand. In a trembling voice, she said, "He believed in Troy. Even after everything, I think he still would have fought for him." The jury took less than 2 hours. Troy Banks was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The church has since rebuilt its youth program, naming the sanctuary steps Elijah's Path. A brass plate is mounted where his body was found. It reads, "He gave second chances, even when it cost him everything." The case still haunts the community, not just because of the murder, but because of the hope that was extinguished. A man who stood for redemption, a boy who couldn't believe in it, and a justice system left to sort through the ashes of what could have been healing, turned into tragedy. The streets of Tempe, Arizona, were quiet on the morning of June 12, 2020, until a 911 call shattered the calm. A man out for a jog near the Papago Park trailhead had stumbled upon something lying just off the path, a suitcase. Its zipper was partially open, and inside, pressed into the fabric lining, was the body of a young woman. The victim was 25-year-old Mia Nguyen, a graduate student at Arizona State University. Bright, driven, and just months away from finishing her master's in forensic psychology, she had vanished 3 days prior after leaving her on-campus apartment to meet someone for coffee. Her phone last pinged near a strip mall 5 miles from where her body was discovered. Inside the suitcase were traces of bleach, hair fibers, and a single item police would later use to piece everything together, a plastic visitor badge from a local tech company called Vertidine. When detectives visited the company's sleek downtown offices, it quickly became clear who the badge belonged to: Darren Bliss, a 36-year-old software engineer and former student at the same university Mia attended. The two had briefly dated years before, but Mia had broken it off, reportedly due to Darren's obsessive behavior. At first, Darren cooperated. He admitted to meeting Mia the day she disappeared, but claimed they parted on good terms. He even offered an alibi. He'd been home all night, working on a personal project. But surveillance footage from a hardware store told a different story. 2 hours after Mia's last known contact, Darren was caught on camera buying duct tape, gloves, and a large suitcase, the same brand and color as the one found in the desert. The timestamp was damning. Confronted with the footage, Darren's demeanor shifted. He stopped answering questions, requested a lawyer, and by the next morning was under arrest for kidnapping and murder. During the trial, the prosecution revealed the obsessive spiral Darren had been trapped in. After Mia ended things in 2017, he never truly let go. Thousands of emails, mostly unsent drafts, were found on his hard drive. Messages he wrote to her, journals that detailed fantasies of fixing what they once had. One entry read, "She doesn't get to walk away from me. Not this time." What made the case even more disturbing was the evidence found inside Darren's home. In his garage was a makeshift soundproof room, padded walls, a folding chair with restraints, and an old phone connected to a camera system. Prosecutors argued that Darren had lured Mia under the pretense of reconciliation, drugged her, and planned to keep her captive. But something went wrong. Toxicology revealed high levels of benzodiazepines in Mia's system, enough to sedate but not kill. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, likely the result of panic during a failed attempt to escape. The defense tried to paint Darren as mentally ill, tormented by rejection, not fully aware of his actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. His purchases, his journals, the prepared space in his garage, it was methodical, planned, calculated. The jury didn't hesitate, guilty on all counts. Darren Bliss was sentenced to death by lethal injection, a rare outcome in Arizona, but, according to the presiding judge, a sentence warranted by the exceptional cruelty and premeditation of the crime. Mia's family created a scholarship in her name for women pursuing degrees in criminal justice and psychology. Her mother, in a victim impact statement, said, "My daughter studied the minds of people like Darren, never knowing one of them had memorized her every move." The case sent a ripple through the academic and legal community alike, not only for the horror of the crime, but for the chilling truth it exposed. Sometimes obsession doesn't burn out. It simmers in silence until it kills. It was just past 4 a.m. on December 19, 2021, when a panicked 911 call came from a gated neighborhood in Palo Alto, California. The caller, 32-year-old tech executive Rachel Lynn, was whispering frantically, barely audible.
"He's here."
"He's inside. I locked the door, but I think he's in the house." By the time police arrived 8 minutes later, it was already too late. Rachel was found in her bedroom, stabbed repeatedly, her body slumped against the wall near the bathroom. No signs of forced entry, no valuables missing. But one window on the second floor was ajar, pried open from the outside. The attacker had come in silently, bypassed security, and went straight for her. The suspect? Her ex-husband, Colin Vega. Colin and Rachel had divorced the year prior after nearly a decade together. The split was messy. Court records showed allegations of psychological abuse, stalking, and threats. But despite multiple restraining orders, Colin remained a looming presence. He was known to linger outside her workplace. Once he sent flowers to a friend's house where she had been staying. And several times Rachel reported seeing his car parked outside her home. But each time, by the time police arrived, he was gone. The final straw came 2 weeks before her death, when Rachel contacted police to report that someone had hacked into her home's smart security system, remotely disabling cameras and sensors. She suspected Colin but couldn't prove it. The account had been accessed from a VPN. When officers asked if she felt in danger, Rachel said yes. But with no direct evidence and no physical breach, there was little they could do. She changed the locks, reinstalled the app, resecured the cameras. It didn't matter. Police traced the break-in by reverse engineering the hack. Colin, a software engineer himself, had built a device that spoofed Rachel's Wi-Fi signal, gaining access to her network. From there, he learned the new security codes, watched her through disabled cameras, and waited. Waited for the perfect moment. Inside Colin's apartment, police found drawings, literal floor plans of Rachel's home, notes on her habits, lists of dates and times she left windows open. But most haunting of all were printed screenshots from the baby monitor camera she had installed in her hallway, images of her sleeping. Rachel had no children. The monitor had been installed just for peace of mind. It had become Colin's window into her life. The trial was one of the most publicized in California that year. Colin's defense tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming that the obsessive behavior was the result of untreated bipolar disorder, worsened by the stress of divorce and financial collapse. But prosecutors weren't having it. They played the 911 audio for the jury. Rachel's whispered fear, the moment she realized he had outsmarted every safety measure she had put in place. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution committed by someone who had learned to exploit not just technology, but trust. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. Colin Vega was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, lying in wait, use of technology in commission of a crime, and violation of a protective order. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Rachel's murder sparked a statewide review of digital privacy laws, particularly in relation to domestic abuse and smart home security. Her family now runs a foundation advocating for tech-related stalking awareness. In a closing statement, Rachel's sister told the court, Rachel did everything right. She left. She protected herself. She asked for help, and it still wasn't enough. Not because she failed, but because he was allowed to keep watching. Her story serves as a grim warning in an age of digital intimacy, where love can turn into surveillance, and safety isn't just a matter of locks and alarms, but of who's still logged in. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.